Welcome back to the human classroom. In the last episode, we talked about what happens when one learner shifts the way we see the entire classroom. Today, I want to zoom out even further because once you start asking why certain learners are struggling, you eventually run into a much bigger truth. Education was never actually designed for individuals. Yeah, I know. It sounds super dramatic, but stay with me, okay? Schools were built for efficiency. We were meant to educate the next generation of laborers and workers. People who could function inside an already established system, right? Sound familiar? And systems like that need blanket goals. They need pacing. They need order. They need predictability. Think assembly line. Pull the lever. Stamp the plate. Move on to the next one. Do it again. Rinse and repeat. If we can systematically produce workers the same way we systematically produce product, then in theory, the machine keeps moving, right? And education borrowed heavily from that thinking. So there became standardized pacing. There became systematized expectations. There became one broad model for how students were supposed to move through learning. Our education system was built to move groups, not to honor the complexity that comes with individuals. It was built for order, management, and measurable outcomes. For the success of getting as many people as possible out the door and into the workforce. But it was not built for curiosity. It was not built for flexibility. It was not built for human variability or vulnerability. And I've sat on both sides of this now. Yeah, we've already discussed. I've been a learner for most of my life, and I have lived it as a parent raising children who are learning inside these same structures, and I have lived it as a teacher to both young adults and very young children. And I can tell you this with absolute certainty. You can feel it when the machine matters more than the person inside of it. There's a very distinct disconnect when the value of a test score matters more than the aha moment behind a child's eyes. I've lived it. I learned differently than the structure wanted me to. But I also became very good at forcing myself to mold into what the system expected me to be. To test the way they wanted me to perform the way they wanted, to struggle quietly, but just enough to still look successful on paper. And when you do that long enough, you begin to feel like a warped and unworthy byproduct of a machine you were never meant to fit inside of. I lived it as a parent, too. I'm still living it, trying to understand how a child can be bright, capable, creative, and full of potential and still somehow unable to perform in the ways the system insists it should to prove that their potential exists. I've also lived it as a teacher, standing in those classrooms where I could physically feel the pressure of those pacing guides and curriculum maps and benchmark expectations breathing down the backs of every single one of my students. But I've also lived the opposite. I have been invited to teach in spaces where we stop grading to a test, where I could decide and my fellow teachers can decide how success would be measured, whether that's portfolios, artwork, exploration, trying new things, asking questions, following inquiry. It did not have to be right. It did not have to be tidy. It was allowed to be messy and human and responsive. And that contrast teaches you something very quickly. You can feel when the machine matters more. You can feel when the timeline matters more than understanding, and you can feel when compliance is being rewarded while connection is quietly disappearing. We love standards, right? because standards are measurable. They're these invisible little check boxes already built into a system for us. Did the student meet the benchmark? Yay! Did they score proficient? Awesome! Did they hit the objective? I look good, don't I? Because my students look good, and the teachers definitely want those scores. We love data because data feels safe. It gives us something concrete to point at. It gives us charts and graphs and numbers that say, see, something is happening here. Good, bad, I don't know, but it's happening, right? Yeah. But measurable does not always mean meaningful. And that's where education gets itself in trouble. Memorization is not the same thing as understanding. I remember being in the 6th grade and being asked to memorize poetry for the first time. I spent days drilling myself until I could recite every line, word for word, exactly the way the teacher wanted me to. And yeah, despite the shaking knees and white knuckling of my sanity and obvious discomfort to stand up and speak in front of others, I could perform it. I could pass the assignment. I could prove that I had technically learned what was asked of me. But memorizing the words did not mean I understood the poem, not one damn bit. And you see, there were 2 poems that year, actually. And they stayed with me. Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken, a classic, and then Edgar A. Guest's poem, Myself. And the irony is, I did not truly understand either of those poems until I had had enough life behind me to recognize myself inside of them. You see, the understanding came later. Long after the grade was entered did I comprehend what those poems meant and how deep they really were. You see, the same thing happens with performance. We often confuse performing well with actually retaining something. So, something meaningful. A student can get a 100. They can get straight A's. They can test beautifully and still walk out of your classroom without having retained any of it. For me, I call it dump and flush. You dump information into you long enough to survive the exam, and then your brain flushes it the second that the pressure is gone, because there was never any authentic connection built to hold it there. We see it in adulthood. Someone can perform very well in a controlled environment and still not have the adaptability, work ethic, curiosity, or problem solving that makes that performance sustainable in the real world. And then there's that sneaky little thing called compliance. Education's favorite illusion. We love compliance students, right? Quiet students, rule-following students, students who check every box on the rubric and move neatly through the syllabus. But compliance does not automatically mean engagement. A student can do the bare minimum required to pass that test or that class. They can smile, nod, turn things in on time, and still never meaningfully connect with what they are learning. They can look successful by every visible standard while remaining entirely untouched by the content. And that is the danger of standardization. We begin rewarding what is easiest to measure: memorization, performance, compliance, while quietly neglecting the deeper things that actually matter: understanding, retention, curiosity, and that important thing like connection. We are so good at counting the visible things, and in education that becomes a real problem because we often measure what is easiest to quantify, not what is most important to cultivate. I think about it like a garden, okay? A gardener can walk outside, look over his beds, and immediately see the bright red ripe tomatoes hanging on the vine. The gardener can count them, they can measure their size, they can weigh them, and they can decide very quickly whether that plant is a productive plant or not. But what they can't see at first glance are the carrots and the potatoes, the onions, the things growing quietly underground that no one applauds. Learning is often like that. The visible fruits are easy to celebrate. Test scores, seat time, the number of students sitting neatly in chairs, how quickly worksheets are completed, how accurately they're graded, behavior charts, quiet hallways, straight lines, everyone appearing aligned and on task. Those are your bright red eye-catching tomatoes. They are ripe. They are visible. They photograph well for data reports. But underneath the surface, there are quieter things growing that take much longer to notice and much more intention to value. A student's creativity, their problem-solving skills, confidence in the child who never spoke aloud, the learner beginning to make meaningful connections between ideas, the emotional regulation that is slowly developing just beneath behaviors that still look messy on the outside, the trust being built between classmates, the safety being built between a learner and an instructor, the curiosity that finally appears when a student begins to feel joy in what they are learning. Those things do not show up on a spreadsheet. They don't fit into neat little percentages. And because they are slower, quieter, and harder to quantify, they are often treated as secondary, even though they are the very roots that sustain long-term growth and lifelong learning. We are very good at counting what we can see, and we are so much worse at honoring the invisible growth happening underneath. Sometimes what schools call success is actually just a student's ability to tolerate the structure they are being forced to remain inside of. I know that's a hard thing to hear, but it needs to be said because it's the truth. A quiet child is often seen as successful. A compliant child is seen as capable. Stillness gets mistaken for attention. Speed gets mistaken for mastery. But none of those things are reliable proof of learning. Sometimes they are simply proof that a student has learned how to survive in the room. Obedience can become this quiet leash that keeps a learner from growing, exploring, experimenting, and questioning. And if we do not ask questions, do we truly learn? If we do not engage with our environment in a full and curious way, how much of that opportunity passes us by untouched? I think about this all the time when teaching college. See, I teach tool training, scenic construction, and sometimes painting. And I tell my students on the very first day something that usually catches them off guard. I'm not grading you on perfection. Honestly, I want to see your mistakes. I want to see your messy. I want to see you take risks and make choices. The only thing I'm an absolute stickler about is safety. You will be safe in my shop, and those rules are non-negotiable. But when it comes to the work itself, I care much more about whether you tried, whether you pushed yourself, whether you made a choice, whether you learned something from it, and where it failed. You can ruin a project, truly ruin it. Fling too much paint, cut the wrong line, make a choice that goes sideways. But if you were trying something intentionally, if you were exploring and thinking and adjusting and asking me questions, then that mistake has far more educational value than a perfectly cautious project that taught you nothing. We often learn the most from our mistakes. But traditional schooling teaches students to fear mistakes so deeply that many stop taking any intellectual risk at all. And what happens then? We produce learners who are very good at waiting to be told exactly what to do and very afraid to move without permission. My students often become more confident the moment I named the thing that they were most afraid of: screwing it up. But once the failure is allowed to exist in the room, experimentation can finally exist there too. You have to build trust, safety, and room for growth. So, At the end of the day, we have to ask a harder question. Are our students truly failing to become educated? Or are we simply trying to educate human beings to function like machinery? We build systems of cogs and sprockets and timelines and production goals, and then we place living, breathing, complicated people inside of them and act surprised when they do not all turn at the same speed. Humans were never meant to be photocopies of one another. They were never meant to be stamped out, identical, efficient, quiet, and interchangeable. And yet so much of education still asks learners to become exactly that. Smaller, tidier, more compliant little versions of themselves that are easier for the machine to process. But individuality is not a flaw in the system. Human complexity is not the inconvenience. It's the entire point. The bright child who asks too many questions. The quiet child whose growth is happening underground. The messy learner who needs to try and fail and try and fail and try and fail and rebuild. The student who does not move at the same speed as the person beside them. Those are not broken pieces. Those are human beings. And if education cannot make room for humanity, then we have to stop asking why the learners are struggling and start asking why the machine still matters more than the people inside it. So, go do something you enjoy, even if it's all you can muster for 5 minutes. Smile at somebody for absolutely no reason and throw off their day in the best possible way. Or, go put your feet in some dirt or stare at a tree like it personally owes you answers. I don't know. But I'll meet you right here, back in the human classroom. In our next episode, we're talking about what accessibility actually looks like in a classroom and why it needs to be more than that checkbox. See you next time. Have a great day.